Hollywood has this weird habit of adapting something millions of people already love, then acting like it knows better than the people who created it. And Christopher Judge, the man behind Kratos in God of War and God of War Ragnarok, basically called them out for exactly that.
Problem with all game adaptations, you have this pre-existing successful property, and the first thing you do is not hire anyone associated with it. The Last of Us, love Pedro. Were they better than the game cast? I saw a stage reading they did. It was unreal. I have no idea why you don't just take that cast, those writers, especially when you're gonna do episodes that are shot for shot remakes of the game. When Amazon, when it was finally approved and announced, and they didn't hire any of the God of War writers, what are you thinking? Like, these guys have been immersed in this world for 20 years, but someone's gonna know better between God of War and God of War Ragnarok and the previous games. How many copies has that sold? I guarantee you it's 1/100th of the audience of God of War. Yeah. So you can't tell these writers how to tell stories.
Judge questioned why Hollywood keeps bringing in outside writers and showrunners while ignoring the people who spent years building these characters and worlds in the first place. And with God of War, that's a pretty important question. If you're adapting a story that became successful because of its writing, why wouldn't you at least talk to the people who wrote it? And this isn't Judge being bitter because somebody else was cast as Kratos. When Ryan Hurst got the role, Judge publicly supported him and called him a great choice. Unfortunately, Hurst reportedly tore his bicep during production and needed surgery, forcing the show to look at recasting the role after filming had already started. That's where things get interesting, because Dave Bautista has now reportedly been discussed as a potential replacement for Kratos. And I can see Bautista working, not just because the guy obviously looks like he could play Kratos, but because he's proven that he can actually do restrained, dramatic performances. Modern Kratos isn't just an angry, muscular guy screaming at gods anymore. Half of that character is what he doesn't say. It's the pauses, the regret, the restraint, and this constant feeling that there's an enormous amount of anger underneath the surface that he's desperately trying to control. Bautista can potentially play that. But here's the thing, changing the actor isn't really the problem. Christopher Judge himself replaced T.C. Carson as Kratos, and we all know how that turned out. Judge completely reinvented the character for a different stage of his life. So somebody else playing Kratos isn't automatically disrespectful to the games. Maybe Bautista comes in and gives us another great interpretation. The bigger issue is whether the people writing Kratos actually understand why the character works. Because we've seen what happens when Hollywood gets that wrong. Look at the 1993 Super Mario Bros. Movie. You had one of the most colorful and recognizable franchises in gaming, and somehow Hollywood turned it into this dark, grimy, dystopian world filled with humanoid dinosaurs. That's like adapting Finding Nemo and deciding Nemo should be a private detective working the streets of Detroit. At some point, you're not adapting the thing anymore. You're borrowing the name because people recognize it. Max Payne might be even more frustrating because the blueprint for a movie was already sitting there. Noir atmosphere, slow-motion action, a broken detective, murder, conspiracy, and revenge. The game was practically begging to become a movie, and somehow the adaptation still felt like somebody had explained Max Payne to Hollywood over the phone, and they tried to recreate it from memory. For years, that was the problem with video game movies. Hollywood wanted the recognizable characters and the built-in audience, but didn't always seem particularly interested in understanding why people loved those games. And that's the distinction that matters here. Fans aren't saying you can't change anything. Of course you have to change things. But faithful doesn't mean identical. It means understanding what made the original work before you start changing it. And we already know that approach works. Fallout went even further. It didn't recreate one particular game at all. It introduced new characters and told a new story. But it still felt like Fallout. That's what fans actually want. You don't have to give us the exact same story. Just don't lose the identity of the thing you're adapting. You don't necessarily need the original writers controlling every decision, and you don't need the original actors playing every character. But why wouldn't you want those people in the conversation? These are people who spent years figuring out why Kratos talks the way he does, why his relationship with Atreus works, and why the quiet moments matter just as much as watching him beat the hell out of a god. And finally, we have some genuinely good news for everybody who's still fighting for physical games. Insomniac has confirmed that Marvel's Wolverine will be completely playable from the physical PS5 disc when it launches on September 15th. And I know how ridiculous that sentence would have sounded 10 years ago. Breaking news! The game you bought on a disc is actually on the disc. Wow, incredible technology. But that's where we are. Senior Project Director Jess Reiner Reed confirmed that Wolverine will release digitally and physically. And importantly, the physical edition isn't just going to contain enough information to point your PS5 toward a gigantic download. The actual playable game will be on the disc. Now, there will still be a day one update. Insomniac isn't pretending that the version pressed onto those discs represents the absolute final state of Wolverine. The studio is continuing to work on polishing the game and fixing bugs right up until launch. Head of Technology Mike Fitzgerald basically explained that Insomniac is full of perfectionists who want to use every remaining minute to tweak little things and make the game better. So yes, you'll probably want the patch. But there's an enormous difference between this patch improves the game and this patch is the game. If the servers disappeared tomorrow, that physical Wolverine copy should still contain something you can install and actually play. And obviously, this announcement hits differently because of everything happening around physical PlayStation games right now. Sony has announced plans to stop producing PlayStation game discs beginning in January 2028, which has caused a massive backlash from physical collectors and preservation advocates. We've seen petitions, protests, and a much larger debate about what ownership actually means when your entire game library becomes dependent on digital storefronts. Insomniac had already confirmed Wolverine would receive a physical release, but during the recent preview event, the developers were inevitably asked about that larger controversy, and Insomniac basically looked at that giant bear trap sitting on the floor and calmly walked around it. Fitzgerald said they wanted to focus on Wolverine, which, yeah, probably the smartest answer possible. They're there to talk about Wolverine, not explain Sony's entire future distribution strategy. But the fact that Wolverine is fully playable from disc still matters, because we're approaching a weird moment where games like this could become some of the final major PlayStation first-party releases where you can walk into a store, buy a disc, put that disc into your console, and actually possess a functional copy of the game without depending entirely on Sony's servers. And there's something slightly depressing about having to celebrate that as a feature. But hey, I'll take the win. The mid-month PlayStation Plus update is here, and August is actually looking pretty strong. Just keep in mind that most regions get the new extra and premium games on August 18th, while the UK, US, and Japan are getting them through weekly releases. There are some genuinely big games joining the catalog this month. First up is Helldivers 2, which is available today. At this point, most people know what Helldivers is about. Grab some friends, travel around the galaxy, spread managed democracy, and occasionally accidentally vaporize your entire squad because friendly fire is permanently enabled. The game has changed enormously since its original February 2024 launch, and its arrival on PS Plus lines up nicely with the new Devotion of Liberty content. The Illuminate have apparently been busy creating new mutated enemies, including creatures that can resist traditional weak point attacks, and others that can regenerate if you give them enough breathing room. Luckily, we're also getting additional battlefield support from SEAF units, and the level cap has now been pushed all the way to 300. So if you've somehow avoided Helldivers 2 until now, this is probably the best excuse you're going to get to finally jump in.
Follow me! Last reload!
Ghost Recon Wildlands is also getting some unexpected attention. As part of the 25th anniversary of Ghost Recon, Ubisoft has updated the PS4 version to run at 4K and 60 FPS when played on PS5. Honestly, Wildlands at 60 FPS is already enough to make me consider reinstalling it, but they're also bringing back some content. There's a new Last Right story involving another threat to track down and eliminate, and more surprisingly, the Predator crossover has returned. That Predator mission disappeared years ago because of licensing, so seeing it suddenly return in 2026 is pretty wild. If you've ever wanted to roam around Bolivia with your squad before getting hunted by an invisible alien with shoulder-mounted plasma weaponry, now's your chance. There are also some PS Plus extra cosmetic items available to claim.
This art is the blackest of blacks.
Taking a shot.
Then, on August 18th, we get arguably the biggest RPG edition of the month, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. The original Come Deliverance was added to PS Plus last month, so Sony has basically handed you Henry's entire medieval misery simulator back to back. Kingdom Come 2 is one of those RPGs where realistic isn't just marketing language. Combat is deliberately methodical. You have to actually learn how to fight properly, and the game isn't particularly interested in making you feel like an unstoppable superhero 5 minutes after leaving the tutorial. That can absolutely push some players away, but if you get through that learning curve, there's an enormous medieval RPG underneath it, with a strong story centered around betrayal and revenge. You're looking at roughly 55 hours for the main story, and potentially around 150 hours if you're chasing everything, so maybe don't start this one if you have plans for the rest of August. August 25th brings another batch of games, starting with Hell Is Us on PS Plus Essential. This is a third-person action game set in a country devastated by civil war and a mysterious supernatural event. You're exploring a semi-open world searching for your missing parents while dealing with strange creatures like Hollow Walkers, and the combat has some Souls-like influences without necessarily trying to become another Dark Souls clone. The game leans heavily into exploration, atmosphere, mystery, and horror, and you're looking at roughly 20 hours for the main experience, or closer to 35 if you're going after the platinum. Metro Exodus is another excellent addition for PS4 and PS5. This takes the claustrophobic post-apocalyptic world of Metro and opens things up considerably, sending Artyom and his companions across a devastated Russia. You've still got mutated creatures, hostile human factions, limited resources, weapon maintenance, stealth, survival mechanics, and the constant fear that something is about to destroy your gas mask at exactly the worst possible moment. It's one of the strongest games in the Metro series, and the main story can be completed in roughly 15 hours, although trophy hunters could spend more than 50. Dying Light 2 is technically another addition, although it was already offered through PS Plus Essential very recently, so there's not much point going over the entire game again. Just know that it's another massive time commitment if you're going for everything, with the campaign taking around 20 hours and completion potentially stretching well beyond 70 or even 100. Vampire Survivors also joins on PS4 and PS5 on August 18th, and this is probably the easiest game here to underestimate. You basically move around while your character attacks automatically, survive increasingly ridiculous waves of enemies, collect upgrades, create increasingly broken weapon combinations, die, and then convince yourself you're only doing one more run. 3 hours later, you're sitting there watching approximately 9 billion projectiles cover the screen, and you have no idea what happened to your evening. It has an average review score around 90, and there's a reason this seemingly simple little game became such a phenomenon. Overall, August is a pretty healthy month. Helldivers 2 and Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 are easily the heavy hitters. Vampire Survivors is dangerously addictive. Wildlands getting 4K 60 FPS and the Predator mission back is a genuinely cool surprise. Square Enix is having a pretty damn good year right now because its latest financial results are in, and almost everything is moving in the direction you want to see. Operating income jumped a massive 88.6% year over year, while net sales increased 32.3%. And what I find interesting here is where some of that growth is actually coming from, because Square Enix's decision to finally start putting more of its games on more platforms appears to be paying off. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth recently expanded beyond PlayStation and PC, with releases on Nintendo Switch 2 and Xbox Series X and S. And according to Square Enix, the game performed strongly on those additional platforms. Who would have thought, right? You put your gigantic Final Fantasy game in front of more people, and more people buy it. I know, revolutionary business strategy. But seriously, I think this is important because Square Enix spent years experimenting with exclusivity deals, and we've heard the company talk openly about wanting to pursue a more aggressive multi-platform strategy. Now we're starting to see some actual numbers suggesting that strategy can work. It wasn't only Final Fantasy VII Rebirth either. The Adventures of Elliot contributed to stronger sales and profits in Square Enix's HD games business, and its older catalog titles are apparently continuing to perform well too. That catalog is incredibly valuable when you think about it. Square Enix has decades of Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and other games sitting in the vault. Every time they successfully bring one of those games to another platform, that's another opportunity to sell something they've already spent years developing. developing. And Final Fantasy XIV continues doing what Final Fantasy XIV does, quietly sitting in the corner printing money. Year-over-year sales and profits increased in Square Enix's MMO business, helped by excitement surrounding the newly announced Evercold expansion. And considering how important 14 has become to Square Enix over the years, seeing that business growing again is obviously great news for them. Even mobile had a good quarter. Dissidia Duelum, Final Fantasy, and Dragon Quest helped increase sales and profits across Square Enix's smart device and PC browser business. Outside of games, publishing net sales increased 11%, amusement was up 3.8%, and merchandising jumped 22.3%. So this wasn't one game dragging the entire company across the finish line. Square Enix had growth coming from several different directions. And I think the biggest takeaway here is that Square Enix finally seems to be benefiting from getting its games in front of as many players as possible. Rebirth doing well on Switch, 2, and Xbox is probably the best advertisement imaginable for continuing that strategy. And with Final Fantasy VII Revelation getting another look at Gamescom, Square Enix is heading into the next phase of this trilogy from a pretty strong position. So what do you guys think? Is Square Enix's multi-platform strategy finally paying off? And do you think Final Fantasy should stay everywhere from this point forward? Crimson Desert has another update, which at this point might be the least surprising gaming headline of 2026. The game launched back in March, and almost immediately Pearl Abyss started patching, tweaking, fixing, and expanding it at a pretty ridiculous pace. What makes this unusual is that Crimson Desert is completely single-player. There's no co-op, no online multiplayer, no battle pass, and no microtransaction store constantly generating money in the background. Yet somehow, Pearl Abyss has been supporting this thing like it's No Man's Sky, Destiny, or The Division. When you actually compare the game we have today to what launched in March, they've changed a lot. Now, I don't want to exaggerate this and pretend Crimson Desert has suddenly transformed into a completely different game. It hasn't. If you fundamentally hated the game at launch, you're probably not going to install it today and suddenly think you've discovered Red Dead Redemption 3. The story is still one of its weaker elements. Cliff isn't suddenly Arthur Morgan, the opening hours can still be confusing, and the game remains this gigantic, beautiful, occasionally messy collection of systems. What is changed is almost everything surrounding those fundamentals, and all of those smaller improvements have started adding up. Difficulty is a perfect example. Crimson Desert originally launched with one difficulty setting, and some of those early boss fights were, let's call them spiritually educational. You learned a lot about yourself, mostly how much anger you were capable of experiencing. Pearl Abyss eventually added easy, normal, and hard modes, adjusted enemy aggression, damage, parry windows, and cleaned up some of those frustrating boss encounters without completely removing the challenge. You can now rematch bosses as well, and liberated blockades can eventually return to their original state, essentially giving you more opportunities to jump back into combat. Then there's the inventory system, which was genuinely frustrating at launch. It wasn't normal RPG inventory management, where you eventually realize you're carrying 17 swords, and maybe that's your problem. The inventory was simply too restrictive. That's been expanded significantly. Sorting and organization have improved, and private storage chests were added, so you're not constantly playing Tetris with armor, ingredients, and random items. Fast travel has also been expanded. The UI and map organization have improved. Shopping and trader interfaces are easier to understand. Font size options were added. Stamina consumption was adjusted. Horse controls were improved. And Pearl Abyss even added cross-save. None of those things individually sound revolutionary, but together, they make the game considerably less frustrating to actually play. They've also added plenty of actual content. We've had new saddles, mounts, pets, armor sets, customization options, improvements for Damien and Unka, more housing decoration, and even options to hide certain weapons and sheaths if you're going for a particular character look. Then Pearl Abyss apparently looked at trading, a system that probably only a relatively small portion of the player base was seriously engaging with, and decided it needed its own economy simulator. The recent trading overhaul added 133 trade posts, new goods, improved profits, supply and demand mechanics, trade routes displayed on the map and minimap, information showing which items are currently in demand, improved storage and transportation, wagons, and wagon shops. At this point, somebody at Pearl Abyss is dangerously close to turning Crimson Desert into medieval Euro Truck Simulator. And then we get patch 1.17, which compared to everything I just mentioned is pretty boring. This update is mostly about fixes. Special headgear effects weren't activating properly in certain situations, so that's been fixed. There was an annoying issue where consuming all all of your assigned food could cause another unintended item or ingredient to automatically take its place. And that's been addressed. The Desperate Rescue Challenge also wasn't properly counting certain instances where you healed an incapacitated companion or ally, and that's now fixed too. There are still some reported problems, including animation stutters and graphical or performance issues, particularly on the base PS5. So Pearl Abyss certainly isn't finished polishing the game. And that's where I think expectations need to become a little more realistic, because look at everything Pearl Abyss has already added or improved. Difficulty options, boss rematches, combat adjustments, stamina improvements, expanded storage, better fast travel, UI improvements, cross-save, more armor, more pets, more mounts, more abilities, housing additions, trading improvements, additional customization, harder difficulty options, respawning blockades, and yes, you can hatch and raise a freaking wyvern. That's a ridiculous amount of post-launch work for a single-player game, especially considering these updates have been free, and there's no microtransaction machine funding them in the background. We also know DLC is being worked on, and that's where I think expectations can reasonably start getting higher. Could Pearl Abyss eventually deliver something closer to a Phantom Liberty-style expansion, with a substantial new area, deeper quests, new mechanics, and perhaps storytelling that improves upon the base game? Maybe. We don't know yet. But personally, I'd rather see development resources going towards something substantial like that than Pearl Abyss feeling obligated to keep adding another 17 armor sets every month because players have become accustomed to constant free content. Eventually, these free updates probably will slow down, and honestly, that's fine. Fix the remaining technical problems, deliver the story improvements you've discussed, continue polishing what needs polishing, and then focus on whatever comes next. A single-player game is eventually allowed to be finished. If Pearl Abyss reaches a point where it says, okay, Crimson Desert is where we want it, and now we're concentrating on DLC, I wouldn't consider that abandoning the game. That's normal. What's abnormal is the pace at which they've been supporting it since March. So no, patch 1.17 isn't particularly exciting. You could probably call it patch 1.16.5 wearing a fake mustache, and nobody would argue with you. But I think the bigger story is what Crimson Desert looks like today compared to what we played at launch. It's smoother, less frustrating, more customizable, easier to navigate, and several of its weaker systems have been significantly expanded. It's still Crimson Desert though, and I think that's the important part. Pearl Abyss can keep renovating the house, replacing the furniture, fixing the plumbing, and repainting the walls, but eventually you reach a point where you stop rebuilding the house and just live in it. Netflix's gaming experiment is going through another major restructuring, and unfortunately, that means more developers are losing their jobs. Netflix is shutting down Night School Studio, the developer behind Oxenfree, and the timing makes this one particularly rough because Night School released its latest game, Unhinged, only about 6 weeks ago. Night School has a pretty important place in Netflix's gaming history too. Netflix acquired the California-based developer in 2021, making Night School the first gaming studio Netflix ever purchased. Before that, Night School had built its reputation with the original Oxenfree in 2016, which became a pretty beloved narrative adventure. The studio later developed Oxenfree 2, Lost Signals, the Black Mirror mobile spin-off Thronglets, and most recently Unhinged. Unhinged was particularly interesting because it was designed specifically around Netflix's cloud gaming technology. It's an interactive horror game where your phone works both as your controller and essentially as the protagonist's phone inside the game. That's actually a pretty clever use of Netflix's ecosystem. Unfortunately, 6 weeks later, the studio behind it is being closed. And Night School isn't alone. Netflix also plans to close Finnish developer Moonloot, which was reportedly developing an Animal Crossing-style life simulation game. There are also layoffs happening within Netflix's internal games team, although the company hasn't disclosed exactly how many employees are affected. Netflix says this is part of another shift in its gaming strategy. The company now wants to focus more heavily on party games, story-driven games, children's titles, and games with broader mainstream appeal, including projects like its FIFA World Cup game. Netflix described this as an opportunity to become more focused in its execution, and said it's reorganizing the gaming business around those priorities. The problem is, we've heard variations of this before. Netflix previously assembled a pretty ridiculous amount of AAA development talent for another internal studio known as Team Blue. We're talking about former Overwatch executive producer Chaco Sonny, Halo veteran Joseph Staten, and former Sony Santa Monica art director Raphael Raphael Grassetti. Those aren't exactly people you accidentally find standing around the office kitchen. Netflix clearly had major AAA ambitions. And then, in October 2024, Netflix shut Team Blue down before it ever released a game. Those developers subsequently left. Night School itself also reportedly went through layoffs in 2025. And I think this highlights one of the biggest problems when enormous technology companies suddenly decide they want to become gaming companies. Games take forever to make. A major game can take 5, 6, sometimes 7 years. Meanwhile, a giant corporation can completely change its strategic priorities between breakfast and lunch. You can hire hundreds of talented people to execute one vision, spend years building it, and then somebody at the top decides the company needs to chase a completely different market. The game hasn't changed. The corporate PowerPoint has. And now Netflix appears to be narrowing its ambitions again. We finally have a date for Arc Raiders' next major update, and this sounds substantially bigger than some of the updates we've seen recently. Frozen Trail launches October 8th, and Embark is calling it the biggest update to Arc Raiders since launch. Now, we knew something larger was coming. Back in May, Embark explained that it was moving away from smaller, frequent updates toward fewer but much bigger releases. That obviously means longer stretches where players are waiting for substantial new content, but Frozen Trail is basically supposed to show us what that new strategy looks like. And the centerpiece is an entirely new map. The new area takes us beyond the mountains into a frozen settlement on the edge of the Rust Belt. This place apparently used to contain villages, factories, research facilities, and even an observatory before everything went sideways. Embark says this map has pushed its level designers in some new directions, particularly when it comes to verticality and exploration. We're going to have threats both above and below ground, and the developers are promising environments that raiders haven't encountered before. The map is actually still being iterated on right now. Embark recently completed another round of user experience testing and is making adjustments based on those results. And I like the frozen setting. Arc Raiders already has this beautiful, abandoned world aesthetic, so throwing snow, mountains, abandoned factories, research facilities, and giant murder robots into the same blender sounds pretty good to me. But a new map obviously isn't enough by itself, and this is where Frozen Trail starts getting more interesting. We're also getting a completely new Arc operation specifically designed for experienced players. Embark is being deliberately vague about what exactly this activity is, but they're describing it as one of the most intense experiences they've created for the game so far. The operation will apparently revolve around meaningful decisions, dynamic encounters, cooperation, combat, risk management, and survival. Basically, this doesn't sound like something where you're going to casually stroll in, shoot 3 robots, grab a toaster, and leave. They're clearly positioning this as some kind of end game or high-level challenge. Although, until Embark actually shows us the activity, I'm keeping expectations under control. There have obviously been leaks and data mines floating around about what this could potentially involve, but none of that is necessary here. Embark says the proper reveal is coming later, so we'll judge the actual version when we see it. Frozen Trail is also introducing multiple new Arc enemies. Again, Embark isn't revealing everything yet, but they've teased enemies ranging from a smaller, highly mobile troublemaker all the way up to a much larger machine that can apparently stop raiders dead in their tracks. And apparently these enemies are a pretty substantial undertaking behind the scenes. Embark says creating a new Arc can take months because they have to develop everything from the original concept and animation through to behavior and the machine learning systems that give these robots their distinctive movement and personality. So right there, we've already got 3 major pillars: a new map, a new high-level Arc operation, and new enemy types. But honestly, the 4th part might be more important for Arc Raiders in the long run. Frozen Trail is expanding progression. One of Embark's big goals is giving players more reasons to continue building their raider over longer periods of time instead of simply doing another run because, well, that's what you do. And part of that is something called the Outposts. Instead of spending all your time hiding underground, players will eventually establish their own space on the surface. You'll be able to decorate the outpost, research new elements of the world, and apparently begin taking steps toward reclaiming the surface from Arc. So yeah, we're basically getting our own little raider home. And I think this could become a surprisingly important feature, depending on how deep Embark goes with it. If it's basically, here are 12 chairs and 3 posters, have fun. Okay, that's nice. But if your outpost becomes tied into progression, research, crafting, unlocks, and other gameplay systems, now you've created something players can continuously build toward. Your successful raids aren't simply numbers going up anymore. You're potentially watching your little piece of the world evolve. The existing skill tree is also being adjusted to give players more control over what kind of raider they want to build. And Embark says raider decks are being reworked with the goal of making them more engaging and rewarding. If you enjoyed this video, hey, maybe drop a like. It really helps a lot and tells me you want more. Subscribe for day one gaming leaks and news, and check out these videos you probably missed. Trust me, they're worth it.